In 2021, Arcane has captivated audiences worldwide with its breathtaking animation, intricate storytelling, and deeply human characters. It wasn't just another video game adaptation. It was a turning point for the industry, setting a new standard in how game worlds and stories could be translated to the screen. Viewers and critics alike all hailed Arcane as a future classic, a masterpiece created by a dedicated team of artists and storytellers who pushed the boundaries of what animation could achieve. Yet, behind this groundbreaking success lies a more complex and at times troubling story. Riot Games, the powerhouse behind Arcane, has faced intense criticism for its handling of creative talent within the company. Despite the show's overwhelming success and the fanbase that it built, Riot has been embroiled in controversies involving artist layoffs and AI use, raising questions about how far a company will go to balance art and profit. Today, we'll explore what makes Arcane so masterful, diving into its somewhat unique animation style, character development, and storytelling choices. But we'll also confront the harder questions, like how does a company that reaches such artistic heights simultaneously undermine the very artists that make the work possible? Join me as we unravel the success and controversies of Arcane and Riot Games. My name is Nick Starlight, and I will be guiding you through how one creates such a masterpiece like Arcane, and the price that one pays to do so. If you end up liking what you see, maybe consider giving the video a like or following me to see future content. But anyways, let's get to the first section. When you first watch Arcane, one thing stands out immediately. Its visual style is unlike anything seen in animation before, more or less. Fortiche, the studio behind the show, has crafted a groundbreaking blend of 2D and 3D animation, creating a painterly look that feels like an oil painting in motion. This approach allowed Arcane to establish an immersive, atmospheric quality that instantly set it apart. But the artistry isn't just improved animation technology. Fortiche's team brought to life two contrasting worlds. The gleaming heights of Piltover, full of bright, opulent technology, and the gritty, shadowed underworld of Zaun. Each setting is meticulously detailed, capturing the socio-economic divide that fuels the story. The visual style doesn't just support the narrative, it's a character in of itself, representing the clash of ideals and the lives caught between the two cities. But I am not the first, nor will I be the last, to give commendation to the visual style. However, with my background of having an animation and illustration degree under my belt, I believe I can give a more in-depth look at Arcane than most. So bear with me as I get into the specifics of the animation. See, dissecting the animation and visual style of Arcane could be a video in of itself, maybe even an entire masterclass taught in schools. But I'll do my best to keep this short but filled with information. If people want to see a more in-depth look of Arcane's visual style and how it's made, I can do a video on that in the future. But for now, let's get some basic vocab out of the way. Visual development is creating the look, feel, and mood of a world of a project. It deals with designing an environment, setting up a color palette for said environment, and drawing the characters based on the story. Visual development art enhances that story's themes by using a strong sense of appeal, color, design, and composition. They might even develop visual effects that are used. A visual development artist isn't always the same thing as being a concept artist, but they do go hand in hand. For Arcane, there was both concept artists and visual development artists, and I'll go into the differences in just a bit. Lastly, we'll cover some basic animation terms. A model is either a 2D or 3D version of a character, environment, or object. Rigging refers to a model that is rigged. It doesn't always have to be a character, but it allows motion to be created or something to affect the model. Material painting or texture painting refers to the way a model looks and how it interacts with light. Think about making something look metallic, glass-like, skin, wood, etc. Okay. To be honest, there's a lot more terms that I'm blatantly leaving out because this video will be way too long, and again, this is not a deep dive into animation in general. But just trust me, there's a lot that goes into any sort of animation. It's not just as simple as pressing a button and having a computer do it, even if you're using AI. When talking about the visual style of Arcane, it's important to know a little bit of animation history. See, it would be a lie to say that the way Arcane is made has never been done before, because it has, multiple times. Combining 2D illustrated textures onto 3D models isn't new. In fact, it's almost always been around. A good example of this is Tarzan. Most people don't realize that CGI, computer generated imagery, was used in the 2D animated movie. Here, they used 2D illustrated backgrounds and 3D painted textures. Sounds familiar, right? Before Tarzan, there were others. Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo in 1958. So no, it's not new. But if it's not new, then why is it so critically acclaimed? Why does the painterly look or graphic style of animations get praised, like Into the Spider-Verse, or Wolfwalkers, or even Klaus? A lot of it has to do with art history. I know it's a lot, stick with me. During the Renaissance and even previously, there was and has always been this unspoken rule about what's considered important art. I'm not giving a full art history lesson, however, I will go over this unspoken rule that has lasted throughout the centuries. It goes something like this. Landscapes and still lifes are considered to be the lowest rank of valued art. Then comes portraits of valuable people as being a middle tier, and finally, historical paintings of battles are considered to be the highest value. Art to this day still more or less follows this rule, and I'm going to prove it with Arcane. See, Arcane is made with 2D illustrated backgrounds, sometimes made on a computer, other times with charcoal or other traditional media. Then the characters, the models, and visual effects are made 3D on a computer with 2D textures. And finally, there's another layer of 2D visual effects added on top to give Arcane that painterly look. But Arcane still follows that unspoken rule. The backgrounds are done meticulously, including details that you could only see while watching a second rewatch of the series. The backgrounds set the mood and setting for the world in which our characters live in. In of themselves, they are a character and tell a story. Piltover is bright and colorful, with gizmos and gadgets throughout the place. It's busy yet compact, like a well-oiled machine. Everything is unique and has a purpose. Here, you can clearly see a bright present day with the hope of a bright future. But on the flip side, Zaun is a rank mess, covered in smog and looks dirty all the time. Here things are made from scraps, not necessarily terrible scraps, but scraps nonetheless. There's varied lighting to show that there's not much sunlight, if at all. Yet, even with the immense detail of these backgrounds, they are still backgrounds. They set the stage to the story, yet could not be alone enough to captivate an audience. So, the next on our ranking is portraits. All the characters are 3D models, for the most part. I'm certain there are some background characters that are just illustrations, but alas, for the sake of argument, they're all 3D models. Each of these models go through a visual development process. As most people know, Arcane is based off of the champions in the game League of Legends. Each champion went through a visual development process there too. However, what makes the characters stand out visually is because they look like the places that they're from. All the characters from Zaun try to look neat and clean. However, there's this underlying notion that their clothes are repaired and put together. Each article of clothing has a purpose, yet unique. Meanwhile, in Piltover, each article of clothing tends to be much more of a fashion statement and an identifier. Each of these characters are clean, but it also shows how advanced Piltover is as well. Arcane does this really well. Not to say that other properties don't, more so, it shows that the visual development of Arcane is extraordinarily well done when one person can tell the difference between a Zaunite character versus a Piltover one, even when they switch sides. But even then, the characters and backgrounds aren't enough to make Arcane a memorable masterpiece. It's the fighting scenes that stand out the most and are valued the most. They're not like a historical battle scene in the sense that you can tell an entire story from one painting alone. However, they do speak about an entire character's wants, needs, and beliefs from the battle alone. I won't go into a deep dive into one of these battle scenes, dissecting every little detail, because honestly, go watch a Netcrit video on it. However, what I will say is that Arcane does this beautifully when a character decides to fight or when not to, and when to include a detailed background versus when not to. Just take a look at the screenshots from the fight scene between Savika and Smeech. But let's get back to the visual style of Arcane. Besides my argument of Arcane following the unspoken rules throughout our history, there is one that I haven't mentioned yet. Visual innovation. See, there are art movements throughout history, specific styles and ideals that have come and gone. The Impressionist movement is visually distinct from the Baroque period, for example. Arcane's creators, Fortiche, knew exactly what they needed to do in order to join the latest movement in film and animation, which is going from realistic visuals to more stylized. See, in 3D animation, the original goal was to see how realistic you could make something, and that has driven the animation industry. Think of simulating fluids to look like real water. It has shaped the industry to today. Now people are having a tough time telling the difference between what's CGI versus what's real, and that's excluding AI as it is. But films and movies are starting to shift towards visual style instead of realism. Not the realism movement for you art history nerds out there, realism as in to mimic real life. Arcane and Fortiche as a whole has mastered this, and will continue to prove so. Fortiche has announced their next film project, which will be Penelope of Sparta, which is inspired by the Greek mythos, again proving my point about the unspoken rule of ranking types of art. My point is that Arcane's painterly visual style is distinct because the creators made it a conscious decision to make the visual development important. I mean, look at the original pitch of Arcane versus how it actually came out. To go in a little in depth here requires a little bit more about the 3D animation process in general, so bear with me. Making something realistic in 3D isn't all that hard. It requires specific knowledge and practice, but it's relatively easy. However, to make something look like it's something else is way harder. When I was studying art in college, Arcane started to come out, and I knew it was the visual style that I wanted to learn. However, I was, and still kinda am, pretty inexperienced with 3D animation, so I used the opportunity to try and mimic what Fortiche was doing with varying degrees of success. How they got the models to look painterly isn't as simple as creating a painterly texture to go on top of the model. I spent hundreds of hours trying to teach myself how to create something like this, and I'm still learning to this day. After many hours of research, trial and error, and many hours of podcasts, videos, here's how they made the visual style for Arcane. It's a mixture of 2D illustrated textures, but messing around with something called an object's normal map. They look like this in Blender, and in most 3D programs. Pretty freaky, huh? Basically, it's telling the computer how light should interact with an object. Don't at me, computer graphic nerds. This is meant to be a simple explanation, okay? Okay. By removing the gradation with the normal maps and making them painterly, you can get something like this to happen instead. With this combined with painterly textures, you can get something to look painterly. As for the 2D backgrounds, which yes, they are 2D, it's a little complex, but let me explain. It's doing something called 2D projection and parallaxing. I've included a few videos in the description that covers these topics more in depth. But at its most basic explanation, it's taking a 2D image and creating layers to make it seem 3D. But yeah, most measures, by the way, are cost-effective rather than making something seem realistic. It's funny to think that the visual development of Arcane is mostly because it is a cost-saving measure, but if you really think about it, it kind of makes sense. Why pay a whole team of modelers to create a 3D scene that the audience might only see for a few seconds, when you can pay a single talented 2D illustrator to create the scene realistically and project it to make it look 3D? But again, this is not an in-depth visual dissection of Arcane, even though it takes up most of my script writing. There is more to Arcane than its visuals, which makes it a visual masterpiece. Ironic, I know. But you cannot have good visuals alone to make a masterpiece. I mean, take a look at Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets. Visually, complex and beautiful, however, the story, not so much. Arcane's creators knew this, which is why they spent so long creating the story, and why League of Legends creators also spend a lot of time writing the lore. The visuals may pull you in, but it's the characters that make Arcane unforgettable. Unlike many adaptations, Arcane doesn't rely on heroes and villains. It's about complex people dealing with impossible situations. The relationship between Vi and Jinx, two sisters on opposite sides of a war, captures the heart-wrenching tragedy of a family torn apart. Through them, Arcane delves into themes of loyalty, betrayal, and trauma. Other characters, like Jace and Victor, aren't simply plot devices. They're driven by their own ambitions and moral struggles. By developing each character fully, Arcane asks its audience to emphasize with different perspectives, to understand the costs of ambitions and the weight of a systemic injustice. This layered storytelling is one of Arcane's most powerful achievements, setting it apart from traditional animated series and elevating it to a level of emotional depth that resonates deeply with viewers. See, Arcane's creators don't ask its audience to root for one character and villainizes another. All the characters are morally gray, more or less, none being completely black or white. All the characters are dealing with real problems that the audience can relate to, all while making decisions and mistakes that the audience can understand. There have been many deep dive videos on the writing of Arcane and why it stands out so much. I really suggest checking out Schnee's videos and videos talking about characters individually in general. But let's talk a little bit more about the writing of Arcane. There are quite a few choices that Arcane makes that most creators would back away from, as they could be deemed problematic. But one of the rules of creating art is that once you understand the rules, you can break them. For example, in a visual sense, once you understand how realistic lighting works, you can break it to create more emotion in a scene. Like how in Lord of the Rings, the lighting is not at all realistic, yet it conveys what it needs to. However, for the writing, this is a little bit more complex, especially coming from someone who doesn't consider themselves as a writer, so take my analysis as a grain of salt. See, writing a character as complex as Jinx, with the trauma attached, is difficult. If it's not done properly, a viewer might not understand the trauma, and or it might make the character unlikable. Powder's evolution to become Jinx takes time and trauma. All of her actions, thoughts, and motions are realistic and mimic real mental wounds that have everlasting consequences. See, the original lore for Jinx goes that she had a childhood tragedy which caused her to grow up manic and impulsive. But the writers of Arcane show why she became this way, and how it's almost justified. From Jinx's point of view, Vi abandoned her, Silco, a father figure, took her in. He taught her how to live in a world so cruel, also allowing her to grow up and experiment. Claggor and Milo, the death of her friends, deeply traumatized her, and for people who've lost friends can understand this. Jinx's character isn't an evil one. In any other show, they would probably make her out to be the villain of the story. However, they make her character more complex than being just a villain. When laid out completely in its basic form, Jinx is Vi's estranged sister, the murderer of Caitlyn's mom, the wanted criminal for stealing crystals, and the reason for the attacks, as Jace thought, Silco's adopted daughter and future of Zaun, and a complete stranger to Heimerdinger. That alone is what Arcane's writers and creators have mastered: complexity. Not a single character is a villain or a hero, a love interest, a friend, or an enemy. Each character is complex and has multiple different archetypes depending on whose view you look at. That is what makes Arcane such a masterpiece. Each character is a piece of the puzzle, treated like a real person. In the real world, you have friends, acquaintances, lovers, enemies, and strangers. All of these characters interact like real people, which makes them memorable. And you can do this in-depth analysis with every character, including the background characters. Every character plays a role in another character's life, and it's not always the same role. At the heart of Arcane is a story about choices, sacrifices, and ambition, a fitting metaphor for Riot Games' own journey. The success of Arcane shows us what's possible when artists are empowered to push the limits of their craft. But the controversies surrounding Riot reminds us of the real challenges creatives faced in the industry today. For audiences, Arcane is a masterpiece. But for the artists involved, the reality is much more complicated. As we celebrate the achievements of Arcane, it's also important to recognize the value of artists who've built this world. Their work is what ultimately leaves a lasting impression on viewers, and it's this balance between creativity and business that will define the future of animation and video game storytelling as a whole. Despite Arcane's success, Riot has faced serious controversy, particularly regarding its treatment of artists who helped bring Arcane to life. In early 2024, Riot laid off numerous employees, including concept artists and other creatives. Ironically, some of these artists were approached by outsourcing companies shortly after, being offered contract work for the same roles that they lost. This reliance on outsourcing is a cost saving measure that prioritizes short term gains over job security and workplace stability. The situation is only intensified with reports of Riot using AI generated art. And to be clear, Riot and Fortiche have a mixed stance on using AI, and so far from my research, there's no reports of AI being used in Arcane except by Netflix. But again, Riot and Fortiche didn't actually make that poster. But in the past, Riot has used AI generated artwork. How does a company that has built an industry defining show justify sidelining its talent in the pursuit of profit? This ongoing conflict between creativity and corporate interests is a harsh reminder of the cost that often comes with groundbreaking art. But it's ironic that the show Arcane mirrors the real world. Jace delivers a speech to Piltover's council on the dangers and benefits of Hextech, touching on innovation's role in society and the fine line between progress and exploitation. The council, driven by profit and power, embodies a corporate mentality that often neglects the well-being of those that it impacts, much like the controversy Riot has faced over artist layoffs and AI use. Jace's struggle to reconcile with his idealism and the council's priorities reflects that the broader industry tension between creative integrity and corporate agendas. This scene makes viewers question who really benefits from technological advances and innovation, a fitting metaphor for Riot's own handling of AI and artist layoffs. Just as Piltover's elite profits at the expense of Zaun's underclass, Riot's cost-cutting measures have been seen as sacrificing the artist who brought its own vision to life. But Jace's story throughout Arcane acts as a harrowing warning to Riot in general. With the pursuit of something that improves lives, it will always come at a cost. If abused and overused, then ultimately it will lead to corruption and waste. The film and video game industry is abusing creatives alike, replacing them and not paying them enough, as well as not giving enough time for projects. If Riot and other companies want to continue along this path, the very works that they are known for will cease to exist as more and more creatives are protesting and burning out. It will be interesting to see where Riot goes after Arcane. My guess is that Arcane will become the next MCU. But going forward, there will be changes in these industries for better or for worse. This is not about AI specifically. However, it's being more and more used widely in the creative industry for better or for worse. I have complicated feelings about AI in general, but it is the underlying fear of many creatives to be rendered useless with the advancements of technology, just like during the Industrial Revolution. Just like with Hextech, will AI in the hands of the people be a force for good, or ultimately a force for destruction? Only time will tell. But anyways, that wraps my in-depth look at creating a masterpiece like Arcane. If you enjoyed this video, I greatly appreciate it. I know I spent a lot of time creating this one in particular. Let me know if you want a more in-depth look at any of the sections or to cover another part of Arcane. I know I personally have a few ideas, but we'll see. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I will see you later.